Hello everybody, you are very welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for the launch of the Laya Healthcare Resilience Rising, Shaping the Future of Work and Wellbeing. It's a report that is designed to continue to support businesses as they navigate the choppy challenges of COVID-19. This is going to be an impressive session because we delve into the second wave of research, 6 months on from our first Brave New Era report, to see what's changed, what are the current insights, the learnings and the practical takeaways for business leaders around the future of work and well-being. Now, this is the fourth event in our Brave New Era series, and today we have an impressive lineup of experts from the world of mental health and well-being and HR leaders from the likes of Unplug, AIR and PayPal. And we're all going to discuss the findings of one of the largest research reports amongst 1,000 employees and 180 HR leaders. So at our event today, we welcome Sinead Prost, who is the Head of Health and Wellbeing at Laya Healthcare, who is with me in studio today. Dr. Sarah O'Neill is a chartered psychologist and the MD of Spectrum Mental Health and a Director of Spectrum Wellness, a strategic partner of Laya Healthcare. Professor John Gallagher is the founder and Chief Medical Officer of Cognate Health. They're specialists in occupational health and a strategic partner of Laya Healthcare. Chris Flack is the founder of Unplug. Trace Gavin is the Director of HR for AIR, and Annette Hickey is the Vice President of Global Operations for EMEA with PayPal. So before we begin, a teeny tiny bit of housekeeping. The event is going to run to 1 hour and 15 minutes, or give or take a few. With our panellists, there is a question section on the right of the screen, so please do send us your burning questions. Now, we've already had a few questions coming in. Keep them coming. We're going to get to as many as we can, and if we don't get to your question today, don't worry, the team at Laya will reply to everybody in the days ahead. So we also have interactive polls. Now, they're running to the right of the screen as well. They're running throughout the event, so do engage with them, and you will see the results appear live on the screen as they happen. So, Sinead, it is lovely to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's been a few months since our last one, and yet we're still here.
Still here and delighted to be here in the studio.
Yeah, and at a social distance, obviously, definitely at a social distance. I mean, we have got to talk about this second major research. I mean, it is very interesting because this is taking the temperature as we go along, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just like to reissue your welcome to everybody on behalf of Laya Healthcare, and thank you for joining us today. It is 6 months on, so it does act like a barometer, which is really interesting. So we see what's shifted in that time. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to unveil what the research is saying and then really tease out some key things with our experts and our guest speakers.
There's a huge amount of information here, and it's all going to be available for download from the website. But if you were to synopsize and put it under 3 key categories, what would they be?
Yeah, so I think the first one is people are working harder, they're working longer, they're finding it difficult to disconnect. That's really starting to come through. Okay, so, you know, on average, those working from home, so let's just really focus in on that for this one, 22 hours a month overtime that they're working. 1 in 2 people saying they're actually admitting they're finding it really difficult to disconnect. And 65% of people saying, I actually feel pressured to log on. I actually feel pressured to kind of continue working when I know I shouldn't be. So that's really starting to come through.
And that's interesting, that amount of people who are feeling the pressure, that pressure, it's possibly not coming from their employer. It could be just pressure that they're putting on themselves.
Absolutely. And I think it's also that, you know, we were talking about this earlier. We are disconnected. We are socially isolated, but it's never been easier to connect with each other because nobody's going anywhere. You know, like I'm here in the studio today, so I'm not at my desk.
Yeah.
Great. Now that would
we
be
got to be out, which is great. Yeah, it's great that we're out.
Delighted. But you know, I could be up at the Dublin office, or I could be out with one of our corporate clients. You know, you're not always behind your desk, but this has become the norm. So that's leading to more of a frenetic, frantic type of working, which isn't always effective.
And of course, that is increasing stress as well, which is a challenge. Productivity, what's really interesting here is that productivity is up, but that's also not a surprise.
Yeah, so again, just being really clear on, you know, the definition of productivity, getting more done in less time. So again, you know, people reacting maybe more so than being responsive. So certainly seeing people admitting, you know, 1 in 2 people saying they're definitely more productive, they're getting more done, but at the risk of happiness. right? So, 27% of people saying they weren't really happy with working from home, that's risen now to 50%. That's 23 percentage points. That's a big shift. And that's starting to impact on company culture.
Yeah, and culture is important because companies need culture. They need to have a reason why people want to stay with them. So that erosion needs to be watched very closely, I'm guessing.
Really closely. And we see that also coming through in motivation. Employers saying, I think in July it was 46% of employers saying they found it difficult to really motivate their employees. That's risen to 66%. Again, that's a huge shift in only 6 months.
The other thing that has become harder over time is that communication part, making sure that you stay connected to your employees wherever they may be at home or if it's an essential workplace, scattered into different locations. And it really has become a challenge to keep people in that communication loop the way you want to.
Yeah, and I think, we had, it's a really good point. And last month we had the virus vaccine vision, our marketing colleagues coming up with those great titles, Rising Resilience Today. But that was really interesting because again, the research is saying, 45% of employees expect their employer to provide the vaccine for them. I think they think it's like the flu vaccine, and we provide that to our corporate clients. But the COVID-19 vaccine is public health. It's not going to be provided by the employer. It's a very, very different type of vaccination program. So clearly communicating that as an employer, but also the employee, understanding what's possible and not, I think that is really important.
There's been a push as well for wellbeing strategies, isn't there? And that has been one of the ways in which they're trying to communicate a message out. Are they working?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I mean, it's great to see they're up. So it's great to see now 3 in 4 people are saying, yes, there's a health and wellbeing strategy in place. I think that's up from 66% in July. But a drop in their effectiveness, okay? So, listen to people. They're working too long. They're working too hard. They're finding it difficult to disconnect. So if you're going to come out with your happiness seminar, it's not going to cut the mustard. So it's really getting in under the bonnet and understanding what the pain points are.
Yes, a happiness seminar. There never would have been one thing I would have signed up to voluntarily, but I suppose we have to try something. There's lots of clear themes coming out. We're going to tease it out over the next while. And there has been a lot of movement since the last report, which was in July last year. So I think we can take that, at best, we are weathering the pandemic. Businesses need to take stock of things like employee well-being, both at home and those who are in the workplace. And they need to help those employees find a balance with supports that alleviate the pressure that everyone is coming under. And you have to understand the staff concerns. You have to stay connected with them. You have to consider the future shape of your business and plan for it with a view to communicate and, most importantly, to manage expectations.
Absolutely.
None of that is easy, but that's why we're here today, to have a chat about it. The one thing that's different since the last day we stood together is the vaccine. And you touched on it there, the expectation that maybe the vaccine should be delivered by the employer, whereas in reality it's going to be delivered by the state. But has that had an impact on people's mood and their outlook?
Yeah, absolutely. So in September, we didn't even know there was going to be a vaccine. We all talked about it. We said it's not going to be ready. And now there's 3 vaccines that have been approved by the European Medical Agency for distribution in Ireland, which is great. Johnson & Johnson to come, and that will definitely be a game changer. But I think Professor John Gallagher will talk a little bit maybe to that later. Definitely not the start of the year we expected, but I think the good bit, Jonathan, is that 80%, almost 80% of people are saying they will take the vaccine, and that's what we need to hold on to. That's really important as an employer, that's endorsed and that's supported.
You mentioned the start of the year, and that gives rise to, I suppose, the biggest challenge that we have as a population. We expected 2021 to be the year where things improve quickly. And then we started the year with the biggest spike that we've had in infections and many more people who lost their lives and a big, hard lockdown that we weren't expecting. That clearly had an impact.
Yeah, that's really taken its toll. So when you look at that landscape and you look at the mood, it's not as positive And I don't, that's maybe too simplified, but in July, there was great hope, it's going to come.
Well, you see, we were moving around a little bit. We were outdoors. We had an opportunity to meet friends, albeit maybe in a controlled environment. Whereas in January, just after Christmas, that was taken away from it.
Taken away from us. And of course, again, as I say, you're parenting from home. So the kids aren't going to school. There's no activities, there's no social outlets. So what you see is, yes, it's not the start of the year that we expected, but that novelty of working from home is wearing off. So in July, you would have seen 27% of people who weren't so happy working from home. That's risen to 51% now.
Yeah, and again, where they're working from as well. The kitchen table, I think, is about a quarter of them. My favourite stat, that was 5% are working from their bed. I don't know whether they're lying down in it or they're using it as a table, but again, that's not sustainable in the long term. Anytime I've been on radio, Sinead, in the last couple of weeks, the one thing that has come through very clearly is that people are worried about the mental health of the nation. Yeah. And this is one of those collective issues. Mental health is normally very individual to people. This is a collective mental health issue as well, and that's been borne through in the survey.
Yeah, so if you look at what the mood was like from a mental health point of view in September, we coined the phrase, the anxious norm. You remember that, right? So we were saying, we wanted everybody to realise that it's not normal to feel anxious all the time, okay? And that was 6 months ago, and that was coming out of 6 months of living with the pandemic. Now we're 6 months on, and that anxiousness is leading into chronic stress. So I think that's really important to realise, we now have 3 in 5 people who are saying they're actually anxious regularly. That's up 17% from July, and that is really a difficult one for employers to manage.
Sinead, thank you very much for that. Well, mental well-being is a prominent issue, as you mentioned, and on viewing the research highlights, the figures certainly reflect this, with individuals working from home and facing several negative challenges due to the restrictions. Homeschooling difficulties being at the top, loneliness being another. There's a whole raft of problems. Dr. Sarah O'Neill is a chartered counselling psychologist, and she's with us. Sarah, how are you? We can see that although employers are prioritising health and wellbeing strategies, employees who responded perceived values of health and wellbeing supports as declining. So how can organisations deal with that? How can they provide better supports that are actually connecting with the employee directly?
Hi, Jonathan, and lovely to be here today as well. I think a part of this is acknowledging where we're at in this at the moment. It's fantastic to see there's hope coming, there's vaccines, there's decreasing daily numbers in Ireland at the moment. But really, day to day, we're still in the weeds. There's 5K restrictions. There's just so many limitations that are there. And there's fatigue associated with that across all sectors of our lives. So I'd suggest part of that kind of decreased feedback in terms of the health and wellbeing strategies is just associated with the grind that we're finding ourselves in currently around that, and that context is really important. So it's important to acknowledge that it's not just the strategies are no longer helpful, it's just day to day is getting more difficult. And it almost reminds me of, before Christmas morning when you were a child, like when Christmas gets closer, it's all the more important to kind of get there. And we're kind of in that phase. We can see hope is coming, and that's really important. But it just reminds us that how difficult this is day to day at the moment. And just before I kind of speak to the organisational strategies and the health and wellbeing strategies, it's important to think about the context generally from what we know about research, from the research. And the COVID research in terms of the mental wellbeing effects, we're still catching up on that. But when we look at, outbreaks and epidemics globally that have occurred over recent years, we have the 2014-16 West Africa Ebola virus outbreak. And when they did quite solid research around that, within the first year, you had 50% of the population experiencing anxiety and depression at this kind of time marker. And unfortunately, they had, almost 3/4 of the population describing symptoms of PTSD. And similarly, when you look at some of the research that came out of the SARS outbreak, for 2 years after the public health environment had become safe again, there was still psychological distress being presented. So it's the kind of, it's the delayed presentation of some of these issues. So context is really important, where we're at in time right now, in terms of this pandemic and the impact it's having on our lives generally. But looking at this research, we're seeing almost 65% of employees are reporting that the pandemic is having a negative impact on their mental health and well-being. And less than 50% of those people are actually engaging with the supports that are there to help them manage that. And, that is slightly of concern, because early intervention when it comes to mental health difficulties is just so important and proven time and time again in research, but also so important not to pathologize this. There's like a societal trauma that we're all going through at the moment. And again, looking at what we understand about trauma, talking about what we're experiencing, that externalization process of putting your story out there, hearing yourself see it, getting some feedback from other people, or even just the act and sharing of itself can be quite cathartic. But it also helps people identify some of the things that they may be able to slightly alter to be able to feel a little bit better within themselves. So really encouraging people who are going through a difficult time to talk about it, to reach out to the supports that are there. I mean, the 24/7 mental wellbeing support program and GP Live that Laya offer are, fantastic resources, but also we're all just human going through this. So, checking in with your colleagues. We all do a great thing of self-censoring. I don't feel like I can share how difficult this is for me on a bad day because it could be difficult for you. So we stop ourselves talking to each other honestly and openly. And so a little bit of ownership around that, saying, today I'm actually doing okay. And so if you're not, that's okay. Please tell me what's going on. And likewise, if we're having difficult days ourselves, checking in with each other and taking that risk to disclose. And again, that's where professional services and external services can be so useful, because there can be a multitude of barriers that stop us speaking to each other kind of honestly about how we're feeling. And if that's the case, if those things are coming up, those external supports are there. And so important to recognize it. Just in terms of the research, when we look at what people are really struggling with, it's social engagement. It's, a lack of having fun in work, and that isolation. Like 50% of employees were talking about less social interaction with colleagues affecting their mental health, 41% feeling disconnected from work, and 40% struggling to motivate themselves. So our coping mechanisms and our resilience is just stretched by this. And the longer this goes on, the more stretched we become. And then when you see the kind of hope of the future coming closer and closer, which is so valid and so important, but it almost makes us want to be there immediately. It illustrates how difficult it is and how much we want this to change. Just one last point around kind of context on this as well. This is not just a workplace issue. Like when we think about self-care, exercise, or, social connection with others, however you exercise, whether it was heading up the hills to go for a walk, going to a gym, playing kind of team sports, a lot of those things are not available to us at the moment. And that just brings it more challenging, because they're the kind of fuel that nourishes our psychological resilience. So in terms of employers, making sure those supports are there and available to people, highlighting that at every opportunity you have, leading by example by sharing, be it from a leadership position or just encouraging that within the organization, and ultimately just naming that this is difficult, but that this will pass. And a last message of hope would be from the psychological literature on trauma. One of the things we know is a concept of post-traumatic growth. So as difficult as these past number of months and a year plus now have been for people, it provides a different perspective. It shows us what can be important to us in life. And that is learning that we can take into the future. It can help us shape our lives in a slightly different way than it had before. I don't think any of us will take a hug with a friend or a family member or going out for a meal for granted again. And whatever it is for you, it's really learning to appreciate what's important in life and maybe changing some things if they need to be, based on the learning and experience through this time.
Well, I think, Sarah, the most important thing is that if you see an 85-year-old plus at the moment, the happiness that they have gotten their vaccine, that kind of gives us an indication that there is indeed that hope. But for the time being, just never assume that all is well and ask those questions. There are significant challenges for employers, and there are ways of helping people through the next difficult few weeks. And don't forget, if you have a question, now is the time to ask it over on the right-hand side of the screen. Engage with our interactive polls. They're running all the time over there as well. One of the key trends that we've already discussed, and we've featured it in both of the reports in this series, it's the right to disconnect, the always-on mentality. 1 out of 2 of us say we cannot switch off, and that is a problem. Our next guest is Chris Flack. He's over 15 years experience in tech and organisational behaviour consulting, and we're delighted to have him with us here today to discuss his view on the report and his advice on how to counteract the negative impact of digital fatigue and the always-on mindset. Chris, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. This research from Laya showing 1 in 2 people cannot do it. They cannot switch off. What is the main driver for that, and how has it gotten worse over the last 12 months?
Hi, good afternoon, Jonathan. Great to be here. So I guess just as a bit of background, we've been in this space for around 6 years, and for us, it's not really that new a challenge. There's just a lot more components. And one of the key things really that's changed is how important technology is for us in our daily life. You know, we need it for work now, and we need it just to have the social connections that we need so much. And because of that, we're using more devices, our screen time is up, our boundaries are blurred. I know Sarah was talking about earlier, you know, essentially as humans, our nervous system as well has gone into a very different state in the last year. But just to focus on 2 key behavioral drivers, and bearing in mind that we're all slightly different, so one of these might be more pertinent than the other. The first is that of psychological detachment. Now, historically, this was relatively simple for us as humans. We'd have quite clear boundaries when we went to work. We'd have a commute. We'd change our clothes potentially, and we'd have a different place to actually work in. And the same would be true as far as our own brain, but our children and families would see those different lines and boundaries as well. But when that all happens at home, it's really hard for our brain to actually detach, because the whole time, as opposed to putting things in different compartments, it's all one zone. So it could be our kitchen table, wearing our pajamas. And if we think of that potentially for our children as well, they're just seeing us at home on our computers, and it's very hard for them to see us actually psychologically detach and for them to psychologically detach. So I guess the ideal scenario is we'd all be lottery winners and we'd live in a big house with a dedicated office, and we'd be able to have very clear boundaries. But if we're living in a small space, we need to essentially just nudge our brain and give ourselves these little almost rituals and ceremonies to create boundaries. So we can do things such as taking a number of micro breaks during the day, but also something that we're finding is very useful for those of us with families is to have something that we actually wear that represents we're working. So that will help our brain to psychologically detach when we take it off, but also for our children when they see us, if they see us on the laptop, they don't assume we're playing Roblox, because for them, sometimes they can just see us on the computer and think we're not working. So, but the more we do that, the more we create those boundaries, the more we help ourselves switch off. And the second big behavioral driver is that of task switching. So this is a bit of a contentious subject because so many of us think we can multitask because we're really good at it, right? But I guess the science has shown us that we can physically multitask, but for the majority of us, we can't actually do this cognitively. Instead, what we do is we do something called task switching really, really quickly, which kind of feels like the same thing. But what we're actually doing is quite exhausting, because every time we switch between a task, there's a concept of attentional blink and attentional residue, meaning that it takes us up to 23 minutes to get back to that original task in hand. So what that means is we're not actually completing tasks, and yet we're feeling really exhausted. So we can't switch off as easily because we're still thinking about those tasks that are open. And one of the things that really encourages that in today's world is the idea of having more devices, so multiple devices open at once. And one key study that we often refer to that's really, really relevant and pertinent to this is that of the iPhone effect. Now, it's something that's called the iPhone effect, but it's relevant to any digital device. It was originally out of Virginia Tech in 2014. It's been replicated loads and loads of times. And what it shows us is that if we have a digital device in our line of sight, even if it's switched off and turned over, it will impact our IQ and empathy by up to 30%. Because as opposed to thinking 100% about that intention in front of us, whether it's a meeting, whether it's our partner, whether it's our family, whether it's our bedroom and sleep, our attention is fragmented. So it's worthwhile, I guess, just having a think about that. For those of you who are at home right now, you may well have other devices open, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's just being aware of that. So, because the more we do that, the harder it is to psychologically detach. And a way to manage that potentially is to put I guess, guardrails in place. And prior to lockdown, a lot of big companies had done things like no device policies in some of their senior management meetings. So the likes of Lacey Robertson at eBay and Sinead McSweeney here in Twitter had no device policies for their senior management meetings. So for them, it was all about focus and respect. And that's now translated and migrated over to video calls, where they're encouraging people just to have a one device policy. And where these guardrails change from tactical to more strategic is where there's work designed to actually assist that. So where companies are educating people as to why they need to do it, because you can put these solutions and guardrails in place, but until people actually understand why, very unlikely they'll actually adopt them, because we need to own the problem first of all. So another thing to encourage less task switching is actually, and more psychological detachment, is to take time away from tech. So practicing something like the Pomodoro technique to encourage micro breaks. Every 25 minutes, you take a 3-minute break. If we're facing facts, I mean, we weren't built to be working in front of a screen 24/7. And I think because of that, it's really, really important that when we're taking those breaks, we make sure, if we can, to get out into nature. So even if it's just a balcony, and try to be with a sentient being, even if it's just our neighbor's cat, because they're the things that we need to survive and thrive as humans.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I feel really guilty because I kept looking down at my iPad here while you were talking and saying that, so I was instantly guilty of what you were talking about. But the blurring of the lines here, Chris, if you have somebody who is used to, in the evening time, watching TV while being on their phone, and then that starts translating into the workday, when we used to physically go to an office, you probably wouldn't get away with it because your colleagues or your boss or someone else would go, and you'd put it away. So you behaved differently in the workplace. Because we're doing it all at home, that means it's going to be very hard to enforce a rule. If there's a company policy being encouraged or enforced, it's harder to do it because people are in their own home, and it's hard to have the same relationship with technology as you would if you were in a workplace.
Yeah, and I guess it's looking at it as far as the reward as opposed to a potential downside and a punishment, because the reward is essentially you're going to be improving your well-being, and that it's going to make it easier for you to work, so to have focus, and easier for you to switch off. But that really comes down to the education, because if it's just pushed out as one policy where it's like, no, you mustn't do this, it's going to be really hard for people to adopt it. Whereby the other side of that, somebody like Sinead McSweeney at Twitter, she was an advocate of this before lockdown, and seeing that come down from leadership and them actually talking about, look, this isn't just about focus, it's about respect, where we can actually have psychological safety of listening to each other and feeling included and connected. I think that's more important. And that, I guess, is one of the challenges at the moment with the likes of work anywhere, anytime, and that whole concept of flexible work arrangements. They're fantastic so long as they have those guardrails and education and actual leadership buy-in. Otherwise, the guardrails are really, really hard to manage.
So guardrails are very, very important. But what's the first thing that companies should be doing to help staff work more effectively in the new world, whatever that might look like?
So I think I'm actually going to cheat and just think of two prerequisites, because slightly away from, I guess, what we would do, what we'd see is probably more important is just for companies to be aware that all their staff are different, and all their staff have very different demands and resources. And in today's world, it's really hard to see demands and resources. If you're just seeing somebody's head, you don't really know if they've got a lot on at the moment or whether they're managing their resources well. So being aware of that. And then as the next step, looking to actually manage their psychological safety through encouraging more community connection, inclusive events. From our side of things, I guess the first thing to do from a managing tech point of view is to find an area that's really pertinent. So if it is something like people challenging with the idea of being able to switch off, it's looking what are the things that potentially would be close by that could help us out with this. So you've already mentioned the likes of the right to disconnect, which could well be introduced as legislation in the next couple of years. And I think one thing that's really important, if that is to be introduced, and ideally from our point of view, it'll be a very loose legislation where individual organizations can adapt it to their own needs, because we're all different, we have different ways of working. But more importantly, it will raise awareness around the subject. And the first thing organizations should do on that, back to the idea of education, because unless we know why we need to do something, it's very unlikely we're actually going to own it and make that change. And from an individual point of view, if we're actually to look to change our behavior and how we use technology, people always ask us, what's that silver bullet? What's the one big thing? We don't jump onto the solution. For us, again, it comes back to you need to understand your own relationship with technology first. Luckily, the likes of Google have tools such as digital wellbeing on Android, and Apple have tools such as screen time on iOS that can actually show us what technology we're using, how much we're using at certain times of the day, and probably more importantly, the context, because some of that could be really good, really useful, communicating with our family or working. And it's almost like thinking of it as digital nutrition, where we're actually putting it into different piles and saying, okay, the high fat, high sugar content I should maybe be using in small amounts, but the more nutritional, green, plant-based foods such as education and collaborative tools I should be using more. And once you're doing that, then discussing it with your friends and colleagues so you actually get some peer buy-in as well.
I mean, look, we're human by nature, so I mean, I think we're all going to ask the simple question, is there a quick fix to this? Is there something that we can do right now that is going to encourage everybody to put this down and concentrate more, either being just themselves or perhaps just easing some of that pressure that we've been talking about? How do we unplug? Exactly.
How do we unplug? Right. Well, I guess, I mean, that is a quick fix, right? That going cold turkey. But it's something we definitely wouldn't advise, especially in today's world. Technology has become so hugely important to us. And, you know, kudos to all the IT departments around the country who've enabled that. But also it's become important to us socially. You know, I'm a non-national, my family are in the UK, I live on my own, and I spend a lot of my time, although I have very clear guardrails, so much of it speaking to people on Zoom. But it is trying to find that one thing that's a challenge. So if it's not being able to switch off, then maybe have a think as to, is there just one thing that I can look at that's interfering with that? Is it having the phone in the bedroom and the iPhone effect? And probably the easiest way to do that is to come back to that awareness piece of looking at the tools that we already have on our phones, just to see what we're using the most, see if we're switching between products a lot, and then maybe just look to very slowly cut that down. But being kind to ourselves, because behavior change is really hard, right? The technology we're talking about here has only really been around just over 15 years, and it's so embedded to our habits that we need to make sure we're making changes, we're doing them on a very, very small basis, but we're also rewarding ourselves. So if I just take the example of technology in the bedroom, if we were to remove technology from the bedroom overnight, we might see that as a punishment, because phones are really useful as far as we might listen to audiobooks, or they might have an amazing song they wake us up to. So try to think of balancing that out by doing it one night a week, introducing it slowly, or if you're going to replace it altogether, introduce an alarm clock that you really like, such as the ones that wake you up with sunlight, or a voice-activated voice assist as opposed to an alarm clock, but something that's actually going to help you in motivation and reinforcing that new habit.
Chris Flack, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
So folks, don't forget to engage with the interactive polls throughout the session. They're over there on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, I'm delighted to welcome Professor John Gallagher, Annette Hickey, Trace Gavin, and Dr. Sarah O'Neill is still here to continue on our conversation. You're very welcome, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. John Gallagher, I'm going to begin with you. It's great to see you again. It's very apparent that business owners and HR leaders need to consider the effect of what we now call long COVID or post-COVID-19 syndrome. It's a hard one for organisations to prepare for. What support should they have in place if one of their employees is suffering from long COVID?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, good to be here. Good to see you again. I guess there are people watching this thinking, will we ever get away from COVID? I mean, we've had COVID for a year and now we're talking about long COVID. Will this ever end? And I suppose that adds into the general sense of gloom and despondency, which seems to be prevalent at the moment. In terms of the pandemic, this is going to end. I mean, we're hiding a good news story and it's only just beginning to get out. This is going to end. It's just that message isn't getting through the noise at the moment. Why am I confident this is going to end? Well, look, the numbers say so. The number of people treated in hospital decreased by 75% since January. 10 to 15% decrease every week over the last 3 weeks. History says so. Every pandemic ends. It's just a matter of when. And I suppose that is the difficult question. But we are going the right direction. And you know, on a personal level, the evidence of vaccine effect is absolutely dramatic. We vaccinated a full campus of healthcare staff. And since we did that, about 2 weeks after the first vaccine, we've seen virtually no staff cases. So this is all going the right direction, and this too will end. And there needs to be optimism, and businesses need to start planning and engaging with staff. So your question, long COVID. Well, just to throw a couple of other spanners into the works, long COVID is one term that's used. You've also got post-COVID and a new one only coined this week, which is post-acute sequelae of COVID by our good friend, Dr. Anthony Fauci. What does it mean? What does that mean for employers? What is long COVID? Well, look, this applies to people who haven't cleared the symptoms of the virus, okay? And it's gone on beyond 1 month. And typically the symptoms are multi-systemic, typically got shortness of breath, a lot of fatigue, headaches, sometimes some palpitations, a brain fog, and a bit of a depressed mood. So a real constellation of things. Estimated about 10% of people who've had COVID are going to have this after 3 months. What does that mean for employers? Well, look, you've got to ensure that your staff, anybody with persisting symptoms, are engaged in medical follow-up. And, one of the figures in the study are that only 46% of employees are afraid to go to the doctor. So I think it's important to communicate with employees and tell them, if you've got symptoms, get assessed medically. Second thing is, you need to have a flexible approach when it comes to post-COVID on return to work, because, if we're saying 10% at 3 months have got persisting symptoms, some of these will want to go back to work but may not be totally symptom-free. So a flexible approach, phased return to work, gradual return to work plans over a period of time, all of which will help them. So look, I think my overall message is, optimism. There must be more optimism. We are in a much better place than perhaps is perceived at the moment. Start planning, because yes, you will be going back to the workplace, and think flexibility when it comes to post-COVID.
I love the way that you keep saying optimism. I love the word optimism. It's something that's getting me through right now. If we could just bottle that and take that from the conversation, if nothing else. Sinead, I suppose one of the knock-on effects of decreased wellbeing has been safety fears about visiting healthcare facilities, with over 46% of employees afraid to go to their GP. I mean, this is an ongoing problem, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And John just touched on that, right? So if we look back at the research results that were published in September from the first wave, that was only 24%. So that's doubled. And, I'm with John on this, it is so important to mind your health. And it's not just about COVID, it's also about making sure that you're listening to those cues and you are reaching out and getting that medical help that you need. 69% of people actually afraid to go for hospital submissions. And these are things that they absolutely may need. And they may not be acute, they may actually be for chronic conditions as well. And we're starting to see that come through in the research. 55% of people saying they put on weight. I was certainly one of them at the start of COVID. Now, I've had to change tack, but also 26% admitting to substance abuse. And I think that is important, that we recognise that we should be really referring on to that medical treatment and really getting access to that when it's necessary.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very important that there are supports available within organisations that people can access, and that they are used, and that you use the supports that are available to your organisations. Annette, if I can turn to you, I mean, I think you've got about 2,400 working in PayPal in Ireland. How challenging has it been for you to maintain any kind of sense of culture with all your employees as they're working remotely?
Yeah, well, culture, they say, eat strategy for breakfast. It's a well-known adage, but recently Gartner have come out say that 69% of leaders actually struggle with trying to manage culture in normal times, let alone these unusual times. But we do know culture is really, really important for organizations. And I suppose employee performance increases 9% in organizations that have better culture. So it's really important for the employee sense of belonging and self-worth, but also for the business benefits as well. So back into kind of PayPal, we as about a quarter of our workforce now have never actually been into the office. With the phenomenal growth of digital payments, we have actually hired them during COVID, so they've never actually met physically their colleagues. So really, how do you not only maintain, but actually deliver and, begin the feeling of what the culture is of PayPal? And I suppose we've done it by, really focusing on what's true to us, and that's our values, one of which, very pertinent to today's webinar around well-being is one of ours, but inclusion, collaboration are also our innovation, are also our values that we I will hold true to. And our employees, hiring employees that have the same value system as our organization. And then, our leaders, our CEO or CFO, they've gone, I think, on Internet Overdrive now. They're out there on LinkedIn and the various different channels now, talking to employees and to the wider organization about PayPal, our employees, our achievements, but tying back our actions right through to the values. More kind of, on the ground with my people, where, what we've been doing is really focusing on engagement of our employees through various events. We teamed up with an events management company who totally focus on the virtual world. So we've had, concerts and well-being events, Pilates classes, art classes, events run by employees as well, based on the various different employee relationship groups as well. So all of this is really, really important for maintaining the engagement and the culture of the organisation.
But it's very hard because, as you say, you can't meet your colleagues, and a quarter of them you haven't even met at all, which must bring its own challenges. Sarah, if I can bring you back in again, I suppose an experience from my own life in the last week or so was my 6-year-old daughter going back to school and seeing the anxiety that was there. I mean, this was a kid going back to meet all of her friends. She was going back to meet the teacher who she thinks the sun, moon and stars of, yet there was an anxiety. And it kind of made me think, well, this is what's going to happen to the grown-ups as well when they have to go back to work. So employers have to prepare for that. I mean, how do they go about creating a supportive culture for their staff, both now when they're still working remotely and as we migrate back to whatever the new form is going to be?
I mean, absolutely. Kids are great because it's that kind of uncensored feedback that you get from them. And so that anxiety that you'll see in kind of younger kids that's, just shown to us all is important to think about in terms of when we're looking after our teams. And, back to what Annette mentioned there, culture is really embedded in the values of the organization and the strategy of the organization. And that's fear from the world prior to COVID and even more relevant now. And I think really important in this is the openness around communications. Nobody really knows how you support organizational growth where 25% of your workforce has never met each other in person. And, PayPal wouldn't be an exception in that space either. For organizations that have had the privilege of growth through this pandemic, it's a new world. And so that openness, engaging with your teams, seeking the feedback of the people who are living this day to day, because you're going to get really great insights and you're going to get the ideas that are based in their lived experience as part of your team and part of your colleague network. From a practical perspective, really kind of encouraging people managers to check in with each other, to seek that feedback from their teams. At an organizational level, thinking about, well, how are we doing that and how are we embedding that in our values and in our priorities as a company? And I think one of the really important things around managing anxiety is trying to support people manage the uncertainty that we're all living with at the moment. And so that isn't about having all of the answers. That's about being open with people, saying we don't have all of the answers. This is what we're thinking. Keep really regular updates, because it's the vacuum of information that can really escalate anxiety. And it's great if you can have leadership live by example. So if we're talking about at an organizational level, we're going to prioritize health and well-being. Well, how are we demonstrating that? And to really challenge ourselves as organizations to think about how are we living by our values and how do we integrate that into our strategy around culture and development of that.
Trace, if I can go to you next. Air was a company that already had a hybrid workforce because you've got lots of people who are out and about the whole time. You've got an indoor crew and an outdoor crew. And obviously the challenges thrown up by COVID, you're a rather important service because you kept us all connected and you kept us all talking via our broadband links. So what advice have you got? What experience do you have about that communications issue when you have people working from home, working out and about, and in the middle of a crisis when there's a lot going on?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the communications are so important. As we know, the best of times, communications are difficult to get the balance right. But when you're thrown into a pandemic situation as we were, it was crucial. We just had to get it right. So in Air, we've had a phenomenal journey in this respect over the last 12 months. And I suppose for us, it was a lot of stages in the journey. Like stage one was literally where we had to close all our stores overnight, bring our sales teams off the roads, move our contact centre and office-based employees into remote working, as well as then ensuring our essential field staff had that support and information they needed to keep themselves safe while continuing to work out in the community, as you say. So our communications had to be fast, informative, accurate, and meet the needs of the both sides of the business. Then came all the pandemic definitions that we all needed to get our heads around, particularly what we had to do, when we had to do it, for how long, what was self-isolation, what was quarantining, what's the difference? A myriad of questions that we really needed to ensure everyone was very clear on, so that we kept each other and our families safe during this time. So we also set up an internal working group with the representatives from all around our businesses who fielded and supported all these kind of questions and answers, keeping the information up to date. If you can remember back then, it changed day to day, month to month. It was a phenomenal change. So we had to ensure that, even when there was government announcements overnight, we had to make sure the information was ready to communicate the next day. So I suppose everybody was looking inward at the company for guidance during this time, and we just had to ensure we communicated the relevant information clearly and timely. Then as things started to continue a little bit, again, we had to change tack slightly because it started to get a little bit harder for people. We weren't seeing family and friends. We were experiencing feelings of isolation, this work-life balance conundrum. So then we knew we had to put some support in place and communicate to employees to help them through the different phases. So this is where we worked with Laya on a whole suite of supports around mental and physical well-being around this time. So we both constantly communicated on the supports that were available, from things like mentioned before, workout classes, mindfulness, mental health awareness, promoting our 27 confidential helpline for employees and their families, how to balance that home and work life, which was becoming a real concern. So it was crucial that we ensured everyone knew what was available and that they utilised it. And then in conjunction with all of this, our CEO, Carol Ann, had been sending weekly update communications to all employees, the kind of general company updates, but we also shared a lot of stories around the company, celebrated milestones, shared examples of the great work people were doing with this during this time. It's actually become something to look forward to now at the end of the week, just to see what's going on, keeping each other in contact with each other, and it's also very informative. So the feedback on this has been really good, and it's been a brilliant communication tool for us. I could go on about all the other initiatives, but I think, I think we did really well during this on communications, and we really understood how important the employee comms was going to be. I believe we've done more and have done better throughout the pandemic than we had before, so it's definitely something now for us to build on going into the future.
Well, you were a communications company to begin with. You just got better at it as time went on. I suppose that's the way to describe it. And of course, there was no playbook on this, and we were all making it up as we go along, but there's been so much we've taken in as a group collectively. John, you're an occupational expert, and bearing in mind we're going to have a hybrid workforce going forward, those working from home, we know there are challenges in that sometimes they're prone to long-term health issues because you reduce your exercise. I mean, I know, yes, I walk more, but on my busy days, I walk less. So how can organisations prioritise their employees' physical health in this new environment where there will be a hybrid?
Yeah, Jonathan, I mean, people will be working from home on an ongoing basis. We know that. And the great thing about this research is that at a time when it's difficult for employers to plan, getting some data and research at least gives them a framework that they can plan around. So we do know that employers see this as being a trend into the future. And we also know that employees are in favor of this. Only about a third want to return full-time to the workplace. So work from home is here to stay. And what are the implications of that for the employers? Now, earlier I mentioned about flexibility, which I think is important, but this is one area where that is caveated. It's important to be flexible, but you do have minimum standards to apply in terms of compliance. Compliance in particular with things like your health and safety legislation and employment legislation. And of course, people working from home have exactly the same entitlements as those who work from the office or workplace. So it's really important that you make sure that you have that baseline compliance done. So I look at this in two ways. First of all, there's the must-dos, and then there's the should-dos. In terms of must-dos, what do employers need to do? Well, it's a bit worrying when you look at the research done here to see that a quarter of those working from home are doing it from the kitchen table. Not good. 15% from the couch, not good. 5% from their bed, really not good. And we are seeing this in terms of staff now being referred with musculoskeletal problems, which isn't unexpected. So it's essential that you get the home set up correct with an appropriate ergonomic evaluation. And that can be done. There's lots of online ways of doing this, or indeed, for particular situations, you can get these done on a visit basis. But there's ways of getting it done, and you must get it done, and you must get it documented. So that's really important. The second thing I'd say is that for any staff member who's got symptoms, it's really important that you get them assessed, just as you would with any staff member that you've got in your workplace who comes to you and says, I have got a problem with this setup or this issue in the workplace. You need to act on that, and you need to make sure you're communicating that to your employees remotely. Okay, so it's more likely that if they're at a distance from you, you may not know unless you ask what exactly they're complaining of. And when you hear it, act on it, get an assessment done. What about the should-dos? Now, here's a tip for you, okay? When you're planning people going back to work, one thing I'd say to you is that the best people to have working from home are those who want to work from home and who it suits, okay? And this is akin to the advice that we give for people who are doing shift work. If you're fighting against something, so you don't want to be working from home, but you have to work from home, you're storing up difficulties. So in your engagement, trying to define and work out who exactly wants to work from home will make that job a bit easier. And the mental health issues, important not to forget about those, not only from the point of view of stress, but also in terms of work from home. Don't forget, there's a blurring of work-life balance here. It's easy for people to go on past the daytime. And as you see again from the research, a lot of people are working past the normal work time hours. So it's important that we don't get into a situation of burnout when people are burning the candle at both ends. Lastly, you saw the figures about gaining weight and substance abuse, 55% gaining weight. This is important, I think, from the point of view of storing up difficulties in the longer term, because without doubt, as we move forward, lifestyle issues are going to become a significant issue in terms of the health and the occupational health of our workforce. And this really does speak to the idea that you need health and wellness support programs built in a connected health approach, which joins up health and wellness in the workplace, occupational health and health promotion, and that will help to improve people's lives, whether they're working at home or indeed in the workplace.
John, thank you. Insightful as always. Now, we've had lots and lots of questions coming through to us here. It's great to see the live polls as well, but I want to spend the last few minutes just going through some of the questions that have come in from members of our audience. Now, some are aimed directly at individual panel members who are here today, so hopefully they'll be able to answer them. And the first one is actually to you, Annette, and it's an interesting one as well. How important is it to encourage your employees to continue to be career-driven, and how can you manage a team remotely for optimum performance? Annette?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. It's hugely important for people's sense of worth, but also for an organisation who are growing as rapidly as PayPal is. We need our employees to be really on their growth edge and developing as well. So it really is important, but you do have to actually manage that, because people tend to work in their own silos, and the talent isn't seen as obviously around the organization as it would be if you're in the tangible office space. So programs to manage that, cross-functional talent management groups, career pathing from, our group in customer care out to maybe the sales or to the back office risk functions, and really organising and structured ways of doing that. But hugely important for both the employee and for the organisation to boot.
Okay, next question. We'll give this one to you, Sinead, if that's okay. As we move forward, what does the future of work and well-being look like? There's a $6 million question for you.
Yeah, I'll try to summarise what I think about that, Jonathan. So Definitely the hybrid workplace is coming through massively in the research. So we see 60% of employers are actively planning that. And that's what employees want. That's what they're going to value. So that's great. Interesting. And John Gallagher touched on it, saying that about a third of people want to go back to the office. That was only a quarter in July. So we are seeing, people do want to work from home. And if it suits them, that's great. But if they don't, it's really making sure that the office is there for them as well. And I think just realising that there is a great opportunity right now to look at what that future can be and what that office is going to be in the future.
I mean, there is a real seismic shift here. We can't understate it, because this time 12 months ago, this was alien. And the idea that we'd even have a hybrid model, that was years away. Yet companies have had to evolve quite quickly to that. And the expectation of the employee, I mean, that's probably the thing that has changed the most, rather than the reality for the employer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is critical that the employee is aware of what they actually want. Do they want to work from home for the far majority of the time, or do they actually want to go into the office? Is it 2 days a week or 3 days a week? And really actively planning for that now, because in September, the government is going to launch its framework for remote working, and that legislation for the right to disconnect, which 96% of people want. I think the 4% got Chris to help them with Unplugged, right? But that's really critical. So really making sure that the policies are there, the legislation is there, and the governance structures are there to support.
Yeah, and again, because we've lots of people who are professionals in the space here, it's going to be a busy few months for HR, isn't it?
It's going to be a busy few months. And to be fair, HR recognising that they may not have all those skill sets, they may not have the skills in employment law, occupational health. So really to realise that the supports are there to support them in this journey.
We keep yakking, but there's questions that I actually genuinely need to ask, as we're conscious of the clock here as well. One last question here. I'm going to direct this one to you, Trace. I suppose Sinead was talking about the future of work there and well-being. This is a decent question to finish off on. How does a health and well-being strategy and partner benefit your organisations, especially when you're planning for a future, more so in a pandemic? So I suppose really what we're asking there is, how do you deal with all of this and plan it?
I mean, it benefits us hugely to have a partnership, particularly in the pandemic. And as been mentioned before, health and well-being is just going to be so important now and going into the future. So we're not experts in everything, so when we can partner with the expert, it is a win-win for your organisation. So, for example, the partnership we have with Laya is crucial and a huge support for our employees, as I mentioned previously. An expert knows what's needed, when it's needed, and are ready for everything you need before you even know you need it, if that makes sense. So, they're crucial to the partnership. We're so focused on what has to be done internally around the health and safety of the employees, and all the remote working, closing stores, opening stores, all those kind of things. You can lose sight of that kind of side of the business. So, a small example in, marking those days throughout the year, World Mental Health Day, we could easily have missed those key dates and not benefited from the fantastic speakers we actually had, as we were frantically looking after the day job, so to speak. So it's invaluable to have that partnership working with you and, getting really good feedback then on your wellness program. So as I said, we're not experts in everything. So to plan, strategize and partner with those that are is really beneficial and something we're going to build on into the future.
Trace, thank you very much for that. Really great answer to that. And lots of questions have come in. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to them all. The clock has beaten us. But Laya have logged all of those questions and have promised to get back to everyone in the coming days who sent a question in. So thank you so much to our panel of speakers for their insight and their expertise today. Sinead, that is it. We have reached the end of another webinar and we've packed as much in as we physically could. So I give with great pleasure, I hand you back. I give your title. I have to read your title. It's very important to get it right.
Okay.
Head of Health and Wellbeing, Sinead Pross. Over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So first to thank you for moderating us. Thank you very much. And then thank you to everybody on behalf of Laya Healthcare for joining us today. I really hope it was helpful. And that you got some practical tips. That's what we always want, that you can take away, go back to your organisation and say, you know what, this is really interesting. These are things that we can address and this is how we can do it. So we can take action. The report is available on our website. So that's Laya Healthcare /Brave New Era /resilience. And you don't have to be a member of Laya Healthcare at all. This is for everybody. So anyone who feels they can make use of it, they can get it from our website. And I think actually if you join today, you'll actually get sent one from our marketing team. So thank you very much. Stay safe and mind yourselves.
Have a good afternoon.